Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. The public inquiry of the Emergencies Act declaration started its public hearings this last week, and I figured I'd take a moment to just kind of differentiate between some of the things that are happening. For example, there is still the parliamentary committee ongoing, and there is this inquiry happening right now. And there's a few things that should differentiate them, which I think we should at least talk about, because this is all about how accountability is supposed to work for this particular emergency mechanism. Now, the parliamentary committee is actually supposed to be something that operates while the act is being invoked. It's supposed to provide real-time oversight of what is happening on the ground, and providing, like if they see that police, for example, are abusing powers, then they can issue declarations and so on from this committee. But what ended up happening in this particular case was the use of the act was so short in terms of time limit that it didn't even complete its vote in the Senate before it was over. Partially, this is a problem with the management of Parliament in terms of the House of Commons and the Senate both taking way too long to come to the votes. Neither of them needed to have days and days of debate. They did anyway. The debate was supposed to be continuous, which didn't mean end at 5:30 and start again the next day. So those aspects were handled poorly. And then when the committee did get constituted, it was supposed to have reported back within 7 sitting days of the act being revoked, or the powers being revoked under the act. But that's not what happened. The committee met, and then they kind of made a declaration, and then kept sitting and kept sitting and kept sitting, and we are now something like 7 months later, and they're still sitting. And it's kind of puzzling because they're not supposed to be doing a post-mortem into what happened. They're supposed to be doing oversight as it happens, and in this particular case, they should have done some kind of particular meeting with the authorities who were exercising the powers, and then provided the report as soon as possible, preferably within those 7 sitting days. But that hasn't happened, and it's still ongoing. And this is in part because we have a lot of opposition MPs who are taking this opportunity to showboat, and others who are trying to embarrass the government over what has happened. But it's not really fulfilling the purpose of what is in the act, and that's something that we should be aware of. When it comes to the inquiry itself, this was again mandated by law, so it had to happen. It has an end date of 360 days after the powers are revoked. So it's got a hard endpoint. The judge in charge of the inquiry did kind of complain about this a little bit, that he doesn't think he's got enough time, but that would involve changing the law in order to extend that time period. I'm sure it could happen if all parties were interested. They did actually just recently change the act as part of the Parliament of Canada Act changes, which allows for more flexibility for senators now that it's not just 2 caucuses in the Senate represented. Now there are more caucuses with the new independent Senate model, and therefore the changes to the Emergencies Act were to accommodate more of those caucuses and leaders as part of the parliamentary committee, which again is still ongoing. So it's not impossible to change the act, but we would need some cooperation to do that. As well, I think it's worth noting that the judge in charge of the inquiry stated that this is not a trial. So when you have witnesses testifying at the committee and you have lawyers doing some cross-examination for different groups that they represent, this is not supposed to be a, this is not a trial. It's not a court process. It's not trying to, use adversarial means to try and arrive at a truth in order for a verdict. This is about, it is fact-finding in a way, it's post-mortem in a way, and the way the Act actually phrases it is the circumstances that led to the declaration being issued and the measures taken for dealing with the emergency. So it should be fairly limited in scope, but I think we're going to see a lot of narratives out there and people who are going to try and protect the narratives that they've been espousing, particularly for groups around organizers of this occupation that happened. And so I suspect, we're gonna see some really interesting things as part of these public witness testimony. We already had the lawyer for some of the occupation organizers try some really curious ways of trying to poke holes in witness testimony around the victims who lived in the area who were being subjected to harassment by the occupiers. And, his statements or his attempts at trying to make their statements did not go very well, but I suspect we're going to see a whole lot more of that over the next 6 weeks, particularly when we have the Prime Minister and Cabinet ministers testifying. There is a curious lack of testimony on the list from the Ontario government, which I think we probably should have had because it was in large part the provincial government's failure for providing enough police resources and using their own powers to try and end the occupation, whereas Doug Ford seemed content to let the Prime Minister handle it so that he could kind of keep his hands clean. And I think that's going to be one of the narratives that comes out of this whole process. There were premiers in particular who seemed content to not do anything until the federal government stepped in. The federal government needed to invoke these powers in order to step in, and even then, it was only to supplement the police of jurisdiction, who were the Ottawa police, who were largely useless throughout the entire affair, and in some cases probably complicit with some of what went on. So that's kind of the differentiation between how those two processes are supposed to work. The parliamentary committee has far exceeded its mandate. It should have ended long before now. It's not supposed to be a fact-finding post-mortem. And yet the showboat impulse is making it as such, and I think we should be aware of that. As for the inquiry, it's going to be an interesting 6 weeks of witness testimony and trying to pack in as much of that as possible because they are under such a tight timeline. So it's going to be interesting, but anyway, these are how those two processes are supposed to work and how that's supposed to provide some accountability for this invocation. There's been some narratives out there from groups who should know better that, the use of this act is to circumvent Parliament. Well, no, Parliament was involved pretty much from day one, and that's all in the legislation, or that it suspended civil liberties, which it didn't, because the whole point of the Emergencies Act is to respect charter rights. And, this was an illegal occupation, and when people were arrested for participating in it at the end, they were afforded due process and, in fact, were largely going through the bail process much faster than people who weren't involved in this occupation tended to be. So, again, I have a hard time with that particular narrative as well. So, we'll see what happens, and stay tuned. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.